In the rugged wilderness of 1880s Colorado, some men choose isolation, not from cowardice but from wounds too deep for town medicine to heal. EZRA Kane has lived alone in his mountain cabin for 8 years, shunned by the valley folk who whisper stories about the hermit who talks to shadows. When he finds 7-year-old LILY Morrison collapsed in a snowstorm with a badly broken leg, his carefully constructed solitude crumbles. For 3 weeks he tends to her with surprising gentleness, sharing his meager supplies and forgotten stories of better days. But when CATHERINE Morrison, the formidable owner of the largest ranch in 3 counties, arrives with her armed men to retrieve her daughter, she expects to face a dangerous savage. Instead, she discovers a man whose quiet dignity and unexpected kindness challenge everything she believes about strength, survival, and second chances. Will a mother's fierce love prove stronger than a lifetime of mistrust? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the pine trees, surrounding EZRA Kane's cabin like the voices of the damned, a sound that had long since ceased to disturb his sleep. He woke before dawn, as was his custom, to the familiar symphony of mountain solitude. 8 years of this routine had carved itself into his bones. Rise with the darkness, tend the fire, check the snares, repair what needed mending, and speak to no soul save the occasional deer that wandered too close to his small clearing. His cabin sat perched on a natural shelf of granite, hidden from the valley below by a thick stand of Douglas fir and aspen. EZRA had chosen this location carefully after his exile from civilization, seeking a place where a man could disappear entirely from the world of other men. The structure itself was modest but well built, constructed with the same methodical precision that had once characterized his sermons. Every log was perfectly fitted, every chink sealed against the mountain cold, every corner squared with the attention of a man who had nothing but time and the weight of his thoughts. Inside, the cabin revealed an unexpected refinement that would have surprised the valley folk, who whispered about the savage hermit. Books lined one wall, their leather spines worn smooth by countless readings. A small desk sat beneath the single window, its surface scarred by years of writing letters that would never be sent. Above the stone fireplace hung a hand-carved wooden cross, its surface darkened by wood smoke and polished by the unconscious touch of fingers that still remembered the weight of faith. EZRA moved through his morning routine with the deliberate grace of a man who had learned to find meaning in simple tasks. He fed the fire with split pine, the flames casting dancing shadows across walls that had heard only his voice for nearly a decade. From a wooden crate beside the hearth he retrieved his most precious possession, a worn leather Bible, its pages soft as cloth from years of handling. The good book fell open to passages he knew by heart, words that had once flowed from his lips with the authority of divine calling. Those days seemed like another man's life now. EZRA Kane, circuit preacher, beloved by congregations across 3 territories, trusted with their secrets and their souls. That man had worn clean collars and spoken the Lord's word with unwavering conviction. That man had believed in justice, in the power of truth to prevail, in the fundamental goodness that dwelt within every human heart. The man who now sat alone in a mountain cabin had learned different lessons. He had discovered that truth could be twisted, that innocence was no shield against accusation, and that sometimes the only honest response to an unjust world was to remove oneself from it entirely. The fire that had consumed his first church had taken more than timber and pews. It had burned away his faith in human nature, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who remembered what it felt like to trust. Outside, snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes that would make travel treacherous for anyone foolish enough to venture into the high country. EZRA watched through his window as the familiar landscape transformed into something ethereal and dangerous. Down in the valley, families would be gathering around warm hearths, children safe in their beds, mothers and fathers planning for tomorrow's needs. Here in his self-imposed exile, Ezra had learned to find a different kind of peace in the absolute certainty of solitude. He dressed in wool and leather, clothing that spoke of function over fashion, then stepped into the growing storm to check his snares. The cold bit at his exposed skin like tiny needles, but he welcomed the sensation. Physical discomfort was honest, unlike the deceits of civilization. Pain didn't lie, or betray, or accuse the innocent of crimes they hadn't committed. As he moved through the forest following paths only he knew, Ezra allowed himself to remember the warmth of human connection. Not often, and not for long, but sometimes the loneliness grew so heavy that even a man dedicated to isolation needed to recall what he had chosen to leave behind. He thought of children's laughter, of shared meals, of the weight of a hand placed trustingly in his own. These memories came to him like fragments of dreams, beautiful and painful in equal measure. The snow fell harder now, muffling all sound except the whisper of wind through branches. In this white silence, Ezra Kane moved like a ghost through his chosen wilderness, unaware that fate was already drawing a lost child toward his carefully guarded sanctuary. The child's cry pierced the storm like a blade through silence, so faint that Ezra almost convinced himself he had imagined it. He stood motionless among the snow-laden pines, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air, listening for the sound to repeat itself. When it came again, weaker now and edged with desperation, something deep within his chest clenched like a fist around his heart. He found her huddled against the base of a massive boulder, her small body nearly invisible beneath a thin layer of snow. 7 years old, perhaps 8, with dark hair plastered against her pale cheeks and lips tinged blue with cold. Her left leg lay at an unnatural angle, and even through his practiced emotional detachment, Ezra could see the telltale signs of a serious break. "Please," she whispered when she saw him approach, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Please help me." Ezra knelt beside her, his large hands gentle as he brushed snow from her face. Up close, he could see the delicate silver chain around her neck, supporting a heart-shaped locket that caught what little light filtered through the storm clouds. Quality jewelry, he noted automatically. This was no poor settler's child, lost in the wilderness. "Easy now, little one," he said, his voice rusty from disuse, but surprisingly tender. "I've got you." He lifted her carefully, mindful of the injured leg, and felt her small arms wrap around his neck with desperate trust. The weight of her against his chest awakened something he had thought buried beyond resurrection. When was the last time another human being had touched him without fear or suspicion? When had anyone looked at him with simple need, rather than the careful calculation of civilization? Back in his cabin, Ezra laid her on his own bed, the rough wool blankets suddenly seeming inadequate for such a fragile burden. He stoked the fire until the room blazed with warmth, then set about examining her injuries with hands that remembered more than he cared to admit about tending to the broken. "What's your name, child?" he asked, as he carefully cut away her torn stockings. "Lily," she whispered, then added with touching formality, "Lily Catherine Morrison." Morrison. The name carried weight in the valley below, attached to the largest ranch in 3 counties, and a woman whose reputation for fierce independence was matched only by stories of her iron will. This was no ordinary lost child. This was the daughter of Catherine Morrison, and her disappearance would bring consequences Ezra had spent 8 years trying to avoid. "Your mama's going to be worried sick," he said, more to himself than to her. "Mama doesn't know I'm gone yet," Lily confessed, her eyes bright with fever and pain. "I was supposed to be helping Mrs. Patterson with the church social, but I wanted to find the place where Papa used to take me riding. I got lost when the snow started." Ezra worked in silence, fashioning a splint from strips of pine bark and torn cloth. His movements were sure and practiced, drawing knowledge gained in frontier towns where doctors were scarce and preachers often served as the closest thing to medical help available. The break was clean, he determined with relief. Painful but not life-threatening if properly set and cared for. As he worked, Lily watched him with the unguarded curiosity of childhood. "Are you the mountain man everyone's afraid?" she asked without accusation, as if inquiring about the weather. "I reckon I am," Ezra replied honestly. You don't seem scary. You have kind hands." She touched the locket at her throat, and her expression grew wistful. Papa had kind hands too, before the fever took him. "Tell me about your papa," Ezra said, partly to distract her from the pain, as he secured the splint, partly because her innocent chatter was balm to his long-starved soul. For the next hour, as the storm raged outside his cabin, Lily Morrison filled the space with stories of a father who had taught her to ride, to recognize bird songs, to find her way by the stars. She spoke of a ranch that sprawled across valley and hillside, of cattle and horses, and vast distances, measured in days rather than miles. Most of all, she spoke of a mother who had grown hard and distant since her father's death, armoring herself in responsibility and grief. "Mama says she doesn't need anybody," Lily confided as sleep began to claim her. "But I think she's wrong. I think everybody needs somebody." As the child drifted off, her breathing deep and even, Ezra found himself studying her peaceful face by firelight. Tomorrow, or the day after if the storm persisted, he would have to take her back to the world below. Her mother would come looking, bringing with her all the complications and judgments he had fled to these mountains to escape. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, Ezra Kane's cabin sheltered more than just his own carefully guarded solitude. In the valley below, word of Lily Morrison's disappearance spread through Millbrook like wildfire through dry grass. Miss Eleanor Patterson had discovered the child missing from her kitchen, where she was supposed to be helping prepare pies for the church social. And within an hour, every soul in town knew that Catherine Morrison's daughter had vanished into the teeth of the worst snowstorm in recent memory. At MacReady's general store, the usual gathering of idle men huddled around the pot-bellied stove, their conversations sharp with speculation and fear. Tom MacReady himself, a rail-thin man whose nervous energy had worn grooves in the floorboards behind his counter, paced back and forth as he shared what little he knew. "Patterson woman says the girl was there 1 minute, gone the next," he announced to the assembled crowd. Asked about riding up to some special place her daddy used to take her. "Fool child probably got turned around in the storm." "That storm's been raging for near 2 days now," observed Sheriff Ben Harper, a graying man whose badge carried more weight than his aging frame suggested. "A child wouldn't last long up there in this weather." Old Pete Garrison, whose rheumatism always flared before bad weather, spat tobacco juice into the brass spittoon with practiced accuracy. "Unless she found shelter," he said ominously. "Question is, what kind of shelter?" The men exchanged meaningful glances. Everyone in Millbrook knew what lay in the high country above the valley. Everyone had heard the stories about the man who lived like a wild animal in those remote mountains, the hermit who'd turned his back on civilized society years ago. "You think she might have run into him?" young Billy Hawthorne asked, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if speaking the words too loudly might summon the devil himself. "That child's as good as dead if she did," Pete declared with grim certainty. "Man who'd live like that, shunning Christian folk, turning away from God's word, ain't natural, ain't safe." Sheriff Harper held up a weathered hand for silence. "Now hold on, Pete. We don't know nothing for certain about Ezra Kane except that he keeps to himself." "Don't know nothing?" Pete's voice rose indignantly. "Ben Harper, that man was run out of Riverside for burning down his own church, had some kind of breakdown, started a fire that nearly killed half his congregation. Only reason they didn't string him up was on account of him being a preacher." The sheriff's expression grew troubled. He remembered the wanted poster that had crossed his desk years ago, bearing the image of a younger Ezra Kane. The charges had been serious: arson, reckless endangerment, destruction of property. The photograph showed a man with wild eyes and unkempt hair, someone who looked capable of terrible things. "That was a long time ago," Harper said quietly, though his own doubts were evident in his voice. "Men like that don't change," insisted Jake Morrison, no relation to Catherine despite sharing her surname. "They just get worse, living alone like animals, talking to themselves, losing what little sense they had left." Outside MacReady's store, the wind howled with renewed fury, driving snow against the windows in angry bursts. The sound sent an involuntary shiver through the assembled men, each of them imagining a small girl lost somewhere in that white wilderness. "Catherine Morrison's organizing search parties," Sheriff Harper announced, straightening his shoulders with the weight of responsibility. "Soon as this storm breaks, we'll head up into the high country. Every able-bodied man in the county's been called to help, and if we find that Hermit's got her." Billy Hawthorne asked, his young face pale with the implications. Pete Garrison's weathered features hardened into an expression that spoke of frontier justice and the swift resolution it promised. "Then God have mercy on his soul, because we sure as hell won't." The wanted poster, yellowed with age and bearing water stains from years tacked to the sheriff's office wall, seemed to mock their efforts with its silent accusation. The face staring back from the faded photograph belonged to a man who had once commanded respect from pulpits across 3 territories, but those days were buried beneath rumors and half-remembered stories that grew darker with each telling. In their fear for an innocent child, the good people of Millbrook had already tried and convicted EZRA Kane in their hearts. They saw only the hermit, the exile, the man whose very presence in their mountains felt like a stain on their Christian community. None of them remembered the gentle preacher who had once baptized their children and blessed their marriages. None of them questioned whether the stories they'd heard might have grown in the telling, shaped by prejudice and fear into something far removed from truth. The storm raged on, and with each passing hour, their certainty of EZRA Kane's guilt grew stronger. Catherine Morrison stood at the window of her ranch house parlor, her hands pressed flat against the cold glass as she stared into the swirling darkness beyond. The storm showed no signs of abating, and with each hour that passed, the knot of fear in her chest pulled tighter. Somewhere out there, her daughter was lost in conditions that could kill a grown man, let alone a 7-year-old child. The parlor behind her buzzed with the controlled chaos of a military operation. Ranch hands sat cleaning rifles and checking supplies, while neighbors arrived with offers of help and grim expression. Maps of the surrounding territory covered her dining table, marked with red circles, indicating areas to be searched once the weather cleared. "Mrs. Morrison," called out Frank Delacroix, her foreman and the closest thing to family she had left besides Lily. "Doc Henderson's here with medical supplies, and the men from the Circle K Ranch just rode in. We'll have near 30 riders ready to head out come morning." Catherine nodded without turning from the window. 30 minutes. It should have felt like enough, but the mountain country was vast and unforgiving. A child could disappear into those peaks and never be found, becoming just another tragic story whispered around winter fires. Her reflections stared back at her from the dark glass, and she saw what 8 years of widowhood had carved into her features. Gone was the soft young woman who had married James Morrison, with stars in her eyes and dreams of building something beautiful together. That woman had been buried alongside her husband 3 years ago, replaced by someone harder, more practical, less inclined to trust in providence or the kindness of strangers. Catherine's hand moved unconsciously to the heavy Colt revolver holstered at her hip, a weapon that had belonged to James and now served as both protection and reminder of what she had lost. She had learned to use it well in the years since his death, when running the largest ranch in 3 counties had required her to prove herself to men who believed a woman had no business in such matters. "Ma'am," Frank said softly, approaching with the careful respect he'd learned to show her grief. "Maybe you should try to get some rest. The men and I can handle the preparations. She's out there, Frank." Catherine's voice was steady, but Frank could hear the steel beneath it, the iron will that had sustained her through her husband's death and the years of struggle that followed. "My little girl is out there in that storm, and every minute we waste is a minute she's getting colder, more frightened." Frank had worked for the Morrison family for 15 years, had watched Catherine transform from a ranch owner's bride into a force of nature in her own right. He'd seen her face down cattle rustlers, negotiate with banks, and bury her husband without shedding a public tear. But he'd never seen her truly afraid until now. "She's a strong girl," he offered, "smart too, like her mama. If anyone can survive up there, it's Lily." Catherine finally turned from the window, and Frank was struck by the raw pain in her eyes. For a moment the iron facade cracked, revealing the terrified mother beneath. She went looking for the place James used to take her riding, their special place up in the high meadow. I should have taken her there myself, should have kept those memories alive for her. The guilt in her voice was palpable. Since James's death, Catherine had thrown herself into the demanding work of running the ranch, leaving little time for childhood adventures or sentimental journey. She had convinced herself that strength meant looking forward, not backward, that dwelling on the past served no one. "You've done right by that girl," Frank said firmly. "James would be proud of the woman you've become and the mother you are." Sheriff Harper chose that moment to enter, stamping snow from his boots and shaking ice crystals from his coat. His expression was grave as he approached Catherine, hat in hand. "Mrs. Morrison, I need to prepare you for what we might find up there," he said without preamble. "There's a man living in those mountains. Goes by EZRA Kane. He's been up there 8, maybe 9 years now." Catherine's eyes sharpened. "What kind of man?" Harper hesitated, weighing his words carefully. "The kind that chooses to live apart from civilized folk." There was trouble in his past. Accusations of arson, and worse. If your daughter encountered him, the sheriff let the implications hang in the air. Catherine's hand moved again to her husband's revolver, and this time the gesture was deliberate. "Then God help him," she said quietly, her voice carrying a promise that made even the seasoned lawman step back. "Because if he's hurt my daughter, I'll make sure he never hurts another child again." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the Morrison ranch house, a different kind of tempest was building. Ezra woke to the sound of soft whimpering, a sound that pulled him from the depths of sleep with startling urgency. The fire had burned low during the night, casting the cabin in amber shadows that danced across rough-hewn walls. Lily lay on his bed, her small face twisted with pain, as fever dreams chased themselves behind her closed eyelids. He moved quietly to her side, noting the flush in her cheeks and the way her breathing came quick and shallow. Infection was always a danger with breaks like hers, especially when proper medical supplies were scarce. Ezra's hands, surprisingly gentle for their size and roughness, touched her forehead and confirmed his fears. She was burning up. From a carefully organized wooden crate near his desk, Ezra retrieved supplies that would have surprised anyone who believed the stories about his savage nature. Clean bandages rolled with military precision, a small collection of medicinal herbs he'd learned to identify and prepare during his circuit preaching days, and even a precious bottle of laudanum he'd been saving for his own possible emergencies. These items spoke of a man who had once carried responsibility for others, who understood that isolation didn't exempt him from the duty to preserve life when it fell under his care. He had ministered to the sick and injured in dozens of frontier towns, learning from doctors, midwives, and folk healers who shared their knowledge with a man of God. "Mama," Lily whispered without opening her eyes, her voice small and lost. "I want Mama." Ezra carefully unwrapped the splint he'd fashioned, checking for signs of swelling or discoloration that might indicate complications. The break itself looked clean, properly aligned, but the child's body was fighting the trauma in ways that worried him. He rewrapped the leg with fresh bandages, his movements practiced and sure. "Tell me about your mama," he said softly, hoping to calm her restless sleep with the sound of his voice. "What's she like?" To his surprise, Lily's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. "She's strong," the child whispered, "stronger than anybody. But she cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking. She misses Papa something fierce." Ezra prepared a weak tea from willow bark, the bitter brew that might help with both pain and fever. As he worked, Lily continued talking, her words coming in disconnected fragments that painted a picture of a family trying to rebuild itself after devastating loss. She used to smile more before Papa got sick, used to sing while she cooked breakfast. Now she just worked, always working, like if she stops moving, something terrible might catch up to her. The honesty in the child's observation struck Ezra with unexpected force. He recognized the behavior she described, the desperate motion that served as armor against grief. He had done much the same thing in his own way, choosing physical exile instead of emotional numbness, but serving the same purpose. "She sounds like a good mama," Ezra said, helping Lily sip the bitter tea. "Someone who cares about taking care of you." "She does care," Lily agreed, then added with a child's devastating clarity, "but she's scared of caring too much. She told Mrs. Patterson that loving somebody just gives them the power to break your heart." As the hours passed, Ezra found himself drawn into conversations unlike any he'd experienced in his years of isolation. Lily possessed the gift of childhood innocence that saw past surface appearances to the truth beneath. She asked him about his books, about why he lived alone, about whether he ever got lonely talking only to himself. "I don't talk to myself," he corrected gently. "I talk to God. Sometimes I even pretend he talks back." "Does he?" Lily asked with genuine curiosity. Ezra considered the question seriously. "I used to think so, before I learned that sometimes God's voice gets drowned out by the voices of men who claim to speak for him." When she asked about the wooden cross above his fireplace, Ezra found himself sharing fragments of his past that he'd never spoken aloud. Not the painful parts, not the accusations and exile, but the good memories of congregations who had welcomed him, of baptisms performed in clear mountain streams, of weddings that had joined two hearts in love and hope. "You were a preacher," Lily said, with wonder. "Like Reverend Williams in town, except nicer." "What makes you think I'm nicer?" "Reverend Williams never would have stayed up all night taking care of a sick little girl," she said with absolute certainty. "He would have said it wasn't proper being a man alone with a child." The simple truth of her words hit Ezra like a physical blow. In choosing to help this child, he had violated every social convention that governed proper behavior between men and children. Yet he couldn't imagine having made any other choice. When he had found her broken and freezing in the snow, the question of propriety had never entered his mind. The storm finally broke on the third morning, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. Catherine Morrison stood in her stirrups as her horse picked its way up the treacherous mountain trail, her father's brass compass steady in her gloved hand. The instrument had guided 3 generations of her family through these mountains, its needle pointing true north with the reliability of faith itself. Behind her rode 28 men, their faces grim with purpose and cold. They moved in a long column through the pristine wilderness, their horses breathing white clouds in the thin air, their saddles creaking in rhythm with the only sounds in the mountain stillness. Each man carried rifle and rope, provisions for days in the wilderness, and the shared determination to bring Lily Morrison home safely. Frank Delacroix rode at Catherine's right side, his weathered face scanning the terrain ahead, with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his life reading the language of the land. To her left, Sheriff Harper maintained the steady pace of someone who understood that haste in such conditions could prove fatal to both horse and rider. "Trail splits up ahead," Frank observed, pointing toward a narrow defile between 2 towering walls of granite. "Left fork leads to the high meadows, where James used to take the girl. Right fork goes deeper into the back country." Catherine consulted her compass, comparing its reading to the hand-drawn map spread across her saddle horn. Her father had sketched these mountains 40 years ago, when he first claimed the land that would become the Morrison Ranch, marking trails and landmarks, with the meticulous care of a man who understood that knowledge meant survival in the wilderness. "We'll split up," she decided. "Take 15 men and search the meadows. I'll take the rest and follow the right fork." If she went looking for James's special place and got lost in the storm, she could have wandered anywhere up here. Sheriff Harper frowned at the suggestion. "Miss Morrison, if that hermit's got her, you don't want to face him with just a handful of men." "The stories about what he's capable of." "Stories," Catherine interrupted, her voice sharp with frustration. "Half the men in this search party are carrying guns because of stories they heard in McCrady's store. What we need are facts, not campfire tales." But even as she spoke the words, Catherine's own hand moved unconsciously to check the loads in her husband's colt. The brass compass had belonged to her father, but the revolver represented her husband's protection, his promise that she would never face danger defenseless. In the years since James's death, the weapon had become as much a part of her daily attire as her boots and hat. The search party divided as planned, Frank's group heading toward the familiar territory of the high meadows, while Catherine led the remaining riders deeper into country that few civilized people had ever seen. Here the mountains rose like cathedral spires toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and the silence was so complete that their horses' hoofbeats seemed to echo across eternity. They found the first sign of habitation 2 hours after the split, a thin column of smoke rising from somewhere beyond a ridge thick with pine and aspen. Catherine felt her heart accelerate as she studied the distant grey line against the pristine sky. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant human presence in a place where no decent person had any business being. Could be a trapper, suggested Bill Hawthorne, though his voice carried little conviction. Could be, Catherine agreed, but her tone suggested she thought otherwise. She had lived in these mountains long enough to know that trappers moved constantly, following game and seasons. Steady smoke from a fixed location spoke of permanent habitation, of someone who had chosen to make these remote peaks his home. The compass needle swung as their trail curved around massive boulders and through stands of timber so thick that noon felt like twilight. Catherine found herself thinking of Lily, wondering if her daughter was somewhere beyond that ridge, wondering what condition they might find her in when they finally reached the source of that distant smoke. "Miss Morrison," Sheriff Harper said quietly, "whatever we find up there, I want your word that you'll let me handle it legal-like, no matter what's happened to the girl." Catherine met his gaze steadily, and for a moment the sheriff saw something in her eyes that made him glad he wasn't the one she was hunting. "Sheriff," she said with deadly calm, "if my daughter has been harmed, there won't be enough law in this territory to protect the man responsible." The compass pointed true north, but Catherine Morrison was following a different kind of magnetic pull now, one that drew her toward whatever lay beyond that ridge with the inexorable force of a mother's love and a mother's fury. Ezra heard the horses long before he saw them, their iron shoes ringing against stone in the thin mountain air. He stood at his cabin window, watching armed riders emerge from the tree line like ghosts materializing from the wilderness itself. 20-odd men, their rifles glinting in the afternoon sun, led by a woman whose bearing spoke of authority and barely contained fury. Inside the cabin, Lily slept peacefully for the first time in days, her fever finally broken and her breathing deep and even. She lay beneath his heaviest quilt, her dark hair spread across his pillow like spilled ink, the silver locket at her throat catching occasional glints of firelight. The sight of her small, trusting form only strengthened Ezra's resolve for what he knew was coming. He reached into the wooden chest beside his bed, past the medical supplies and carefully folded linens, to retrieve something he hadn't touched in 8 years. The white clerical collar emerged from its tissue wrapping still crisp and clean, a remnant of the man he had been before the world taught him that righteousness could be twisted into accusation and faith could be weaponized by those who understood neither. The collar felt strange against his neck after so many years, too tight and formal for the mountain man he had become. But it was also a reminder of who he truly was beneath the beard and buckskins, a symbol of the calling that had once defined his entire existence. If he was going to face an angry mother and her armed companions, he would do so as Reverend Ezra Kane, not as the wild hermit of their imaginations. Through the window he watched the woman dismount and approach his cabin with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command. Even at a distance, he could see the resemblance to the child sleeping in his bed, the same determined set to her shoulders, the same dark hair escaping from beneath her hat, the same fierce intelligence in her eyes. Catherine Morrison. He had heard stories about her, even in his isolation, tales carried by occasional hunters and trappers who ventured into the high country. The widow who had taken over her husband's ranch and run it better than he ever had. the woman who could outride most men and outshoot the rest, a mother who would move heaven and earth to protect her child. Ezra stepped outside before the search party could reach his door, his hands visible and empty, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The white collar at his throat seemed to glow in the late afternoon light, a stark contrast to his rough mountain clothing. "That's far enough," he called out when the riders were still 20 yards away. "The child is safe and sleeping. She doesn't need to wake to the sound of armed men shouting accusations." Catherine Morrison pulled her horse to a halt, her hand resting on the butt of her holstered Colt. This close, Ezra could see the exhaustion in her face, the red-rimmed eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and desperate worry. But he could also see the iron will that had sustained her through 3 days of searching, and the barely leashed fury of a mother who feared the worst. "Where is my daughter?" she demanded, her voice carrying across the clearing with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Inside, resting," Ezra replied calmly. "She's been ill with fever, but the crisis has passed. She'll recover fully." Sheriff Harper urged his horse forward, his rifle held ready but not quite aimed. "Step away from the cabin, Kane. We're taking the girl home." "Of course you are," Ezra agreed, "but carefully. She has a broken leg that's just beginning to heal properly. Move her wrong and you could cripple her for life." The unexpected concern in his voice seemed to confuse the mounted men. They had come prepared for confrontation with a dangerous madman, not a reasoned discussion with someone who spoke like an educated man and wore the collar of the clergy. Catherine dismounted and took several steps closer, her hand never leaving her weapon. "If you've harmed her in any way, I've done everything in my power to save her life," Ezra interrupted quietly. "Your daughter was dying when I found her. Broken leg, exposure, hypothermia. Another hour in that storm and you'd be planning a funeral instead of a rescue." The simple truth of his words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She studied his face, searching for signs of deception or madness, but found only steady conviction and what appeared to be genuine concern for Lily's welfare. "You're not what I expected," she admitted grudgingly. "Most people aren't," Ezra replied, then gestured toward his cabin. "Would you like to see your daughter? She's been asking for you." For the first time since receiving word of Lily's disappearance, Catherine Morrison allowed herself to hope that this story might have a happy ending. Catherine stepped across the threshold of Ezra's cabin, her hand still resting on her weapon, but her attention immediately drawn to the small figure lying in the bed against the far wall. The interior surprised her, not the rough cave she had expected, but a well-organized home that spoke of intelligence and care. Books lined makeshift shelves, and a carefully tended fire cast warm light across clean floors and tidy furnishings. "Mama." Lily's voice was weak but filled with joy as she recognized her mother's silhouette in the doorway. "Mama, you found me." Catherine crossed the room in quick strides, her earlier caution forgotten in the overwhelming relief of seeing her daughter alive and alert. She knelt beside the bed, her hands gentle as she touched Lily's forehead and cheek, checking for fever, injury, any sign that her worst fears had been realized. "I'm here, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion she had been holding back for 3 days. "Mama's here." Behind her, Sheriff Harper and 2 other men crowded into the cabin, their rifles ready despite the peaceful scene before them. Their eyes swept the room suspiciously, taking in details that challenged their preconceptions about the mountain hermit. This wasn't the lair of a madman, but the home of someone who valued order and learning. Lily struggled to sit up, wincing as movement jarred her splintered leg. "Mama, this is Mr. Kane. He saved my life. He took care of me when I was hurt and sick, and he tells the most wonderful stories about when he was a preacher." Catherine's eyes found the quilt that covered her daughter, and she drew in a sharp breath. The needlework was exquisite, each stitch precise and even, the pattern complex enough to have taken months to complete. This was the work of patient hands guided by skill and artistry, not the crude creation of a savage living in isolation. "Where did this come from?" she asked, touching the soft fabric with wonder. Ezra stood in the doorway, his presence filling the frame, his posture deliberately non-threatening. "I made it," he said simply. The winters are long up here, and a man needs something to occupy his hands and mind. Sheriff Harper snorted in disbelief. You expect us to believe a man like you can do needlework? A man like me? Ezra's voice carried a note of gentle challenge. What kind of man do you think I am, Sheriff? The lawman gestured vaguely at Ezra's rough appearance, his isolated cabin, the very fact of his existence apart from civilized society. The kind that runs from the law, the kind that burns down churches and threatens innocent folk. Catherine watched her daughter's face during this exchange, noting the way Lily's expression shifted from confusion to indignation. The child clearly held no fear of the man who had sheltered her, and Catherine had learned to trust her daughter's instincts about people. He didn't burn anything, Lily said with the fierce loyalty of childhood. He told me about the fire. It was an accident, and he tried to save everyone. He went back into the burning building 3 times to make sure no one was trapped inside. Ezra's face went pale at the child's words. He had shared more of his past with her than he had intended, drawn out by her innocent questions and obvious need for stories to distract her from pain and fear. Lily, he said softly, that's not something your mama needs to hear about. But Catherine was studying his face with new interest, seeing past the beard and weathered features to something that made her earlier assumptions seem suddenly foolish. This man had the hands of someone accustomed to gentle work, the voice of someone educated beyond what the frontier typically produced, and the manner of someone who had once held positions of trust and responsibility. You were really a preacher? She asked. I was, Ezra confirmed. For 15 years I served congregations across 3 territories, until the night my church burned, and I was blamed for setting the fire. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Catherine found herself believing him despite every warning she had received about his dangerous nature. Men who lived by violence and deception didn't create beautiful quilts for warmth or risk their lives saving children who meant nothing to them. The stories they tell about you in town, she began, are mostly lies built on a foundation of fear, Ezra finished. I chose exile rather than fight accusations I could never truly disprove. Sometimes the only honest response to an unjust world is to remove yourself from it. Sheriff Harper remained skeptical, his rifle still ready, but Catherine could see doubt creeping into his expression as he took in the evidence before his eyes. The gentle way Ezra interacted with Lily, the obvious care with which he had tended her injuries, the simple fact that she was alive and well after 3 days in his custody. I owe you an apology, Catherine said quietly, and a debt I'm not sure I can ever repay. You owe me nothing, Ezra replied. Any decent person would have done the same. But as Catherine looked around the cabin that had sheltered her daughter, at the quilt that spoke of patient craftsmanship and the books that revealed an educated mind, she began to wonder if perhaps decency was rarer than either of them wanted to admit. The truth emerged slowly, like dawn breaking over the mountains, as Catherine insisted on hearing the full story of Ezra's exile. They sat around his small table while Lily dozed fitfully, the child's presence serving as an anchor of innocence in a conversation heavy with old pain and injustice. From a wooden box beneath his bed, Ezra retrieved documents he had carried with him into exile, papers yellowed with age, but still bearing the official seals that had once meant everything to him. Legal documents, character references, and most importantly a letter from the territorial marshal's office that told a story very different from the whispered rumors that had followed him into the mountains. The fire started during evening service, Ezra began, his voice steady but distant as he revisited memories he had spent 8 years trying to forget. Someone had left a lamp too close to the curtains behind the pulpit. By the time anyone noticed, the flames had already spread to the roof beams. Catherine examined the marshal's letter, noting the official letterhead and the careful legal language that exonerated Ezra of all criminal charges. The document was dated 6 months after the fire, long after he had already disappeared into the wilderness, rather than endure the suspicion and accusations of his former community. It says here that you were cleared of all wrongdoing, she said, looking up from the pages with confusion evident in her voice. The investigation concluded the fire was accidental and that your actions saved 17 lives that night. By the time they finished their investigation, I was already gone, Ezra replied with bitter resignation. The damage to my reputation was done. Even after the truth came out, people preferred to believe the dramatic story of a mad preacher who burned his own church rather than the mundane reality of an accident caused by carelessness. Sheriff Harper leaned forward to examine the documents himself, his weathered face growing increasingly troubled as he read the official findings. The letter praised Ezra's courage in repeatedly entering the burning building to ensure all congregants had escaped safely, and noted that he had suffered severe burns to his hands in the process. "These scars," Harper said suddenly, gesturing toward Ezra's hands. "They're from the fire." Ezra nodded, flexing fingers that still showed the telltale marks of old burns. Third-degree burns on both hands took months to heal, and they never quite worked the same way afterward. Made it hard to write sermons or handle the delicate work that comes with ministering to folks. Catherine studied his hands with new understanding, seeing past the calluses and weathering of mountain life to the deeper marks of sacrifice. These were the hands that had pulled people from a burning building, that had risked everything to save the lives of people who would later turn against him based on nothing more than fear and speculation. "Why didn't you fight the accusations?" she asked. "Why didn't you show people these documents? Would you have believed them?" Ezra asked quietly. "If you'd heard stories about a dangerous hermit living in the mountains, would official papers have changed your mind? Or would you have assumed they were forged, or that I'd somehow fooled the authorities?" The question struck Catherine with uncomfortable force because she knew the answer. She had ridden up the mountain, prepared to face a dangerous criminal, her mind made up by rumors and assumptions that had seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. Even seeing the evidence of his innocence, part of her mind still struggled to reconcile the gentleman before her with the monster of local legend. "People believe what they want to believe," Ezra continued, "and sometimes what they want to believe is that bad things happen because of bad people, not because of random accidents that could strike anyone at any time. It's more comforting to think that disasters are caused by villains than to accept that tragedy can come from simple human carelessness." Lily stirred in her sleep, murmuring something indistinct, and all three adults turned their attention to her small form. The sight of the innocent child served as a reminder of what really mattered. Not the past accusations or present suspicions, but the simple fact that she was alive and safe because of the man they had come prepared to arrest, or were. "The wanted poster in my office," Sheriff Harper said slowly. "It's 8 years old, based on initial reports before the investigation was complete. And yet it's still hanging there," Ezra observed without bitterness. "Still shaping people's opinions about a man they've never met." Catherine folded the legal documents carefully, her movements reverent as she handled the proof of Ezra's innocence. "This changes everything," she said quietly. "Does it?" Ezra asked. "Or will people simply find new reasons to fear what they don't understand?" Outside the cabin, the other members of the search party waited with growing impatience, their assumptions about the mountain hermit unchanged by the peaceful scene playing out beyond their sight. 3 weeks later, Catherine sat at her kitchen table staring at a piece of paper that had arrived with the morning post. The handwriting was careful and precise, each letter formed with the deliberate care of someone unused to holding a pen. Yet the words themselves sparkled with the innocent enthusiasm that could only come from a 7-year-old child. "Dear Miss Kane," the letter began, and Catherine found herself smiling despite the complexity of emotions the correspondence stirred within her. "Mama says I am supposed to write thank you letters to people who help me, but that doesn't seem like enough for saving my whole life. I want to invite you to come see our ranch sometime. Mama said I could ask if I wanted to, but she also said not to be disappointed if you say no because you like your mountain home too much." Lily had spent 3 days composing the letter, erasing and rewriting sections until Catherine had finally suggested they use a fresh sheet of paper altogether. The child's determination to express her gratitude properly had been both touching and heartbreaking, especially since Catherine wasn't entirely sure how she felt about maintaining contact with the mountain hermit, who had become such an unexpected presence in their lives. The letter continued with the rambling enthusiasm that characterized Lily's conversation, describing the ranch, the horses she thought Ezra might like to meet, and her conviction that he would enjoy the view from the hill where her father was buried. The child's innocent assumption that someone who had shown her kindness would naturally want to remain part of her life cut straight to the heart of Catherine's own confused feelings about the man who had saved her daughter. "I told Frank all about you," Lily had written. "He says any man who can stitch a quilt like that and tell stories like you do would be welcome at our table any time. Mama just gets quiet when I talk about you, but she does that sometimes when something makes her think too much." Catherine set the letter aside and walked to the window that overlooked the sprawling acres of the Morrison ranch. The spring grass was coming in strong after the late snows, and the cattle were fat and healthy in the morning sun. This was her domain, the empire she and James had built together and that she now managed alone with competence that had surprised even her closest allies. But lately she found herself thinking about isolation and the price a person paid for choosing safety over trust. Ezra Kane had spent 8 years alone in the mountains, content with his books and his solitude, and the certainty that he could trust no one but himself. Catherine had spent 3 years building walls around her heart, armoring herself against the possibility of future loss by refusing to let anyone close enough to matter. They were both exiles in their own way. She realized his exile was geographical, hers emotional, but they served the same purpose, protection from a world that had proven itself capable of inflicting unbearable pain. Frank Delacroix knocked on the kitchen door, interrupting her thought. He entered without waiting for permission, a liberty earned through 15 years of loyal service and genuine friendship. "Morning, Catherine," he said, noting the letter on the table. "That from the little one? She wants to invite Miss Kane to visit the ranch," Catherine replied, not quite meeting his eyes. Frank poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, his movements casual but his attention focused on Catherine's carefully neutral expression. "And what do you think about that?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that had been troubling her since they had ridden down from Ezra's mountain cabin. What did she think about the possibility of seeing him again? What did she think about the way his quiet dignity had challenged her assumptions? What did she think about the strange sense of recognition she had felt when looking into his eyes, as if she were seeing someone who understood the weight of carrying responsibility alone? "I think," she said finally, "that Lily has good instincts about people. Better than her mother, apparently." Frank smiled at that, recognizing the admission for what it was. The man did save her life. Seems like common courtesy to offer him a decent meal and a chance to see how she's healing up. "It's not about courtesy," Catherine said quietly. "It's about what happens after the meal is finished and the social obligations are met. What happens when Lily gets attached to someone who's made it clear he prefers solitude to society?" "Maybe," Frank suggested gently, "you ought to ask him that question yourself." Catherine picked up Lily's letter again, reading the child's closing words. "I hope you will come visit us, Mr. Kane. Mama needs more friends, even if she's too stubborn to admit it. Your friend always, Lily Morrison." The letter felt heavier than paper should, weighted with possibilities and complications that Catherine wasn't sure she was ready to face. Ezra stood before the cracked mirror in his cabin, adjusting the black wool suit he hadn't worn in 8 years. The garment still fit, though it felt strange against his mountain-hardened frame, too formal and confining after years of buckskin and homespun. The fabric carried the faint scent of cedar from the wooden chest, where it had been carefully stored, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moths and moisture. This had been his Sunday best during his preaching days, tailored in Denver during a rare flush period, when his circuit had included several prosperous mining towns. The suit represented the man he had been before exile, before accusations, before he had learned that sometimes the world's judgment could strip away everything a person believed about themselves. His hands shook slightly as he worked the buttons, muscle memory warring with years of disuse. How many Sunday mornings had he dressed this way, preparing to stand before congregations who trusted him with their spiritual welfare? How many times had he smoothed these same lapels while reviewing sermons in his mind, considering which passages would best serve his flock's need? The white collar came last, the clerical band that had once represented his calling and authority. It felt tight around his neck, almost suffocating after years of open shirts and freedom from formal constraint. But LILY Morrison had invited him to Sunday dinner, and if he was going to venture back into the world of civilized society, he would do so properly dressed for the occasion. Ezra examined his reflection critically, noting how the years of isolation had changed him. His hair was longer than any preacher would wear, streaked with gray that hadn't been there when he fled to the mountains. His skin was weathered by wind and sun, marked by the honest wear of outdoor labor. His hands, visible at his cuffs, bore the permanent calluses of a man who split his own wood and tended his own needs. He looked like what he was, a hermit playing dress-up, a mountain man trying to remember how to be civilized. The contradiction felt uncomfortable, as if he were wearing a costume from someone else's life. But beneath the self-doubt, something else stirred. For 8 years, Ezra had convinced himself that he was content with solitude, that he needed nothing beyond his books and his carefully maintained routine. The rescue of LILY Morrison had cracked that certainty, and her innocent letter had widened the fissure into something that demanded acknowledgement. He missed human contact. He missed conversation that went beyond the basic necessities of survival. He missed the weight of responsibility for others' welfare, the sense of purpose that came from being needed rather than merely tolerated. The ride down the mountain tested both his resolve and his rusty social skill. Twice he nearly turned back, convinced that he was making a mistake that would end in humiliation for himself and disappointment for the child who had shown him such undeserved kindness. The closer he came to the valley, the more aware he became of the stares and whispers that would follow his appearance in public. The town of Millbrook looked smaller than he remembered, its single main street lined with the same weathered buildings that had been there during his last visit 8 years ago. But everything felt different now, charged with the weight of his reputation and the stories that had grown around his exile. People stopped their conversations to stare as he rode past. A woman hurried her children inside when she recognized him, her face pale with the kind of fear reserved for dangerous predators. Men gathered in small groups, their voices low but their gestures animated as they discussed the unexpected appearance of the mountain hermit. At Macready's general store, the usual collection of idle men fell silent as Ezra rode by. He could feel their eyes following his progress, noting his formal attire and speculating about his destination. By the time he reached the edge of town, he knew that every person in Millbrook would know about his venture into civilization before sunset. The Morrison Ranch sprawled across the valley floor like a testament to human ambition and perseverance. Ezra had heard stories about its size and prosperity, but seeing it firsthand impressed him with the scope of what James Morrison had built and his widow now maintained. This was the domain of someone accustomed to command, to making decisions that affected dozens of employees and thousands of head of cattle. What was he doing here? What business did a failed preacher and self-imposed exile have at the table of one of the territory's most successful ranch owners? The gulf between their circumstances seemed too wide to bridge with simple gratitude and a child's innocent invitation. But as he approached the main house, Ezra saw Lily waiting on the front porch, her face bright with excitement despite the walking stick she still needed to support her healing leg. Her joy at seeing him arrive was so genuine, so uncomplicated by the doubts that plagued adult minds, that his reservations began to seem less important than the simple fact that someone wanted his company. For the first time in 8 years, Ezra Kane was stepping back into the world of other people. The Morrison ranch house impressed Ezra with its understated elegance, a structure that spoke of prosperity earned through hard work rather than inherited wealth. But it was the portrait hanging above the stone fireplace that captured his attention and held it with unexpected force. The painting showed a man in his 30s, handsome in a rugged way that suggested comfort with both boardroom negotiations and cattle drives. James Morrison gazed out from the canvas with the confident smile of someone who had found his place in the world and intended to keep it. His eyes held warmth and intelligence, and his posture suggested the kind of natural leadership that inspired loyalty rather than demanding it. This was the man who had built the empire Catherine now managed, the husband whose death had transformed a ranch owner's wife into one of the territory's most formidable business leaders. "That's Papa," Lily said, following Ezra's gaze to the portrait. "Mama had it painted from a photograph the year before he got sick. She talks to it sometimes when she thinks nobody's listening." Catherine entered the room at that moment, her timing suggesting she had heard her daughter's innocent revelation. She wore a simple dress of deep blue that emphasized her natural beauty while maintaining the practical elegance of someone who understood that ranch life demanded both function and form. Her hair was arranged more formally than Ezra had seen it, and she moved with the confident grace of a woman comfortable in her own domain. "Mr. Kane," she said, extending her hand in greeting. "Thank you for accepting Lily's invitation. I hope the ride down wasn't too difficult." "Please call me Ezra," he replied, taking her offered hand and noting the calluses that spoke of someone who didn't shy away from physical work, despite her prosperity. "And the ride was educational." Catherine's expression suggested she understood exactly what he meant. The hostile reception in town wouldn't have escaped her notice, and she was undoubtedly aware of the gossip that would follow his visit to her home. Frank Delacroix emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel and wearing the comfortable smile of someone genuinely pleased to see an expected guest. "Ezra, good to see you again under better circumstances. Hope you brought your appetite. Catherine's been cooking since dawn." The foreman's easy acceptance seemed to help bridge the awkwardness that might have otherwise marked the beginning of the visit. Frank had been present during the tense confrontation at Ezra's cabin, had seen the evidence of his innocence, and clearly held no reservations about welcoming him into the Morrison home. Dinner conversation flowed more easily than Ezra had expected, touching on safe topics like the late spring weather, the prospects for the summer cattle market, and Lily's remarkable recovery from her injuries. The child dominated much of the discussion, regaling them with plans for the summer and questions about mountain wildlife that demonstrated her insatiable curiosity about the world beyond the ranch. "Tell them about the eagles," she urged Ezra, between bites of roast beef. "Tell them about the nest you showed me in your stories." As Ezra described the golden eagles that nested in the cliff face near his cabin, he found himself watching Catherine's reactions from the corner of his eye. She listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to evaluating people through their words and manner, but he also caught glimpses of something else, a wistfulness that suggested she understood the appeal of wild places and simple freedoms. "It sounds peaceful," she said when he finished describing the eagle's hunting patterns. "Sometimes I think about what it would be like to walk away from all the responsibilities, all the decisions that affect so many other people's lives. The peace comes with a price," Ezra replied carefully. "Isolation protects you from other people's expectations, but it also cuts you off from their warmth, their companionship, their different ways of seeing the world." After dinner, Lily insisted on showing Ezra around the ranch, her walking stick clicking against the wooden floors as she led him through rooms that spoke of a family's history and aspirations. But it was in James Morrison's study that Ezra felt the full weight of the dead man's presence. The room remained exactly as James had left it, down to the half-finished letter on his desk and the reading glasses folded beside an open ledger. Catherine had preserved it as a shrine to her husband's memory, a place where his essence seemed to linger in the arrangement of books, the selection of maps, the personal touches that revealed his character. "Mama doesn't let anyone else in here," Lily confided in a whisper. "She says it helps her remember Papa the way he was when he was happy." Standing in that carefully preserved space, Ezra began to understand the depth of Catherine's loss and the magnitude of the emotional walls she had built to protect herself from further pain. James Morrison hadn't just been her husband, he had been her partner, her anchor, her connection to a future that had died with him. How could any living man compete with the idealized memory of such a love? As the evening deepened and Lily finally succumbed to exhaustion from the excitement of having a guest, Catherine and Ezra found themselves alone on the front porch, the vast expanse of the ranch spreading out before them under a canopy of stars. The silence between them was comfortable, but charged with unspoken questions and careful evaluations. Catherine's hands rested in her lap, and in the lamplight spilling through the window, Ezra could see the thin gold band that still circled her ring finger. The wedding ring caught the light like a beacon, a visible reminder of vows that death had interrupted, but not dissolved. She wore it with the unconscious habit of someone for whom its presence had become as natural as breathing. "She talks about you constantly," Catherine said finally, her voice soft in the mountain air. "Every day something reminds her of a story you told, or a kindness you showed. You've become quite the hero in her imagination." "Children have a gift for seeing the best in people," Ezra replied. "It's one of the things that makes them both wonderful and vulnerable." Catherine turned to study his profile in the dim light, noting the way his scarred hands rested easily on the porch railing, no longer hidden beneath gloves or shadows. "Those scars," she said, "from the fire, they must have been painful." Ezra flexed his fingers, the old injuries pulling tight in ways that still reminded him of that terrible night. The physical pain healed, the other kind that took longer. "Tell me about it," Catherine said quietly. "The real story, not the version Lily heard." For a long moment, Ezra considered deflecting the request. The full truth of that night was something he had shared with no one, a burden he had carried alone through 8 years of exile. But something in Catherine's voice, a recognition of shared pain perhaps, made him want to trust her with the weight of his memories. "It was a winter evening, much like this one," he began. The church was full for evening service. Families with children, elderly folks, grateful for the warmth, young couples planning their futures together. "I was preaching about forgiveness, about second chances, and the possibility of redemption." He paused, the irony of that final sermon not lost on him. Someone had placed an oil lamp too close to the curtains behind the pulpit. "During my sermon, I noticed a flicker of orange light that didn't belong. By the time I realized what was happening, the flames had already reached the ceiling." Catherine listened without interruption as Ezra described the chaos that followed. The screams of frightened congregants, the crushing rush toward the narrow doors, the terrible choice between his own safety and the lives of people trapped inside the burning building. "I went back in 4 times, he said, his voice barely audible. "Each time the smoke was thicker, the flames higher. The last time, I found old Mrs. Henderson collapsed near the back pew. The ceiling was starting to come down, and I knew if I carried her out, we might both die. If I left her, she certainly would, but you saved her." "I did. But by the time I got her outside, my hands were burned raw, and half the town was convinced I had started the fire myself. Someone had seen me near the lamp earlier, arranging flowers for the altar. In their panic and grief, that became evidence of arson rather than innocent preparation." Catherine touched the wedding ring unconsciously, turning it around her finger as she processed his story. "And you didn't stay to fight the accusation." "I was exhausted, injured, and facing a community that needed someone to blame for their trauma. The easier I made it for them to cast me as the villain, the sooner they could begin healing from what they'd experienced. So you sacrificed yourself for their peace of mind." "I told myself it was noble," Ezra said with bitter honesty. "But looking back, I think it was cowardice. It was easier to run away than to face their doubts and suspicions day after day, waiting for vindication that might never come." Catherine was quiet for a long time, studying the stars and turning her wedding ring with movements that spoke of deep thought. "James used to say that the hardest battles are the ones where you're fighting for something people can't see or understand, fighting for principle instead of property, for truth instead of profit. He sounds like a wise man. He was. Catherine's voice carried a weight of loss that 8 years hadn't diminished. He died believing in people's fundamental goodness, convinced that truth would always win in the end. Sometimes I wonder if he would have been as optimistic if he'd lived to see how easily fear can corrupt even good intentions. The wedding ring continued its slow rotation around her finger, a physical manifestation of her internal struggle between past love and present possibility. Ezra watched the gesture with growing understanding of the choice she faced, not just whether to trust him, but whether to risk her heart on anyone ever again. The trouble began 3 days later, when Reverend Marcus Williams arrived at the Morrison ranch with a delegation of concerned townspeople. Catherine watched through her kitchen window as they approached. 5 men and 2 women, their faces set with the righteous determination of people, convinced they were protecting their community from moral corruption. At the center of the group, Reverend Williams carried himself with the pompous authority of someone who believed his position granted him the right to judge others' choices. Behind him walked Mayor Thompson, Sheriff Harper, and several prominent business owners whose opinions carried weight in Millbrook's social hierarchy. Catherine met them at her front door, her bearing calm, but her hand resting meaningfully on the porch railing near where her husband's gun belt hung within easy reach. She had learned in the years since James's death that projecting strength often prevented the need to use. Reverend Williams, she said with cool politeness, "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" The preacher straightened his black coat and assumed the posture he used for delivering sermons about sin and redemption. "Miss Morrison, we've come as friends and neighbors who are concerned about your welfare and that of your innocent daughter." "My welfare seems to be managing quite well, thank you." "Perhaps," Mayor Thompson interjected, mopping his sweating brow with a handkerchief, despite the cool morning air. "But surely you understand our concern about your association with a known criminal." Catherine's eyes hardened at the implication. "Mr. Kane is not a criminal. The Territorial Marshal's office cleared him of all charges years ago." "Legal technicalities aside," Reverend Williams proclaimed, his voice taking on the rolling cadence he used for particularly dramatic sermons, "the man has lived apart from Christian society, shunning the fellowship of believers and the moral guidance of the church. Such isolation breeds dangerous thoughts and unnatural behaviors." Sheriff Harper shifted uncomfortably, clearly remembering the legal documents that had proven Ezra's innocence, but his discomfort didn't translate into courage to contradict the Reverend's pronouncements. "Miss Morrison," said Eleanor Patterson, the banker's wife who considered herself the arbiter of proper social behavior in Millbrook, "you must consider the example you're setting for your daughter. What message does it send when a respected widow entertains a man of such questionable character?" The implication in her words was clear, and Catherine felt her temper flare. These people were questioning not just her judgment, but her moral character, suggesting impropriety based on nothing more than their own prejudices and fears. "The message it sends," Catherine replied with dangerous quiet, "is that my daughter and I are capable of judging character for ourselves. Thank you very much." Reverend Williams seized on what he perceived as defiance. "Pride, Mrs. Morrison, is the sin that leads to all others. Your husband was a God-fearing man who would never have countenanced such associations. Surely his memory deserves better than to see his widow and child corrupted by the influence of a man who has turned his back on civilized society." The mention of James was a mistake, and Catherine's hand moved unconsciously to touch the wedding ring that still bound her to his memory. These people had no right to invoke her husband's name in service of their narrow-minded crusade. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice low but carrying across the yard with unmistakable authority. "Don't you dare presume to speak for my husband or judge what he would or wouldn't approve of. James Morrison was twice the man any of you will ever be, and he taught me to value character over reputation, substance over appearances. Mrs. Morrison," the Reverend tried again, "we're simply trying to protect you from making a mistake that could have serious consequences for your standing in the community." "And what consequences would those be exactly?" Catherine demanded. "Will you refuse to buy cattle from my ranch? Will you exclude my daughter from school? Will you deny us the basic courtesy of neighbors because I choose to associate with a man who saved my child's life?" The delegation exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly not having expected such direct confrontation. They had come prepared to browbeat a widow into submission, not to face down a woman who possessed both the will and the means to make their threats meaningless. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat nervously. "Now, Catherine, no one's talking about social isolation. We're simply suggesting that perhaps Mr. Kane would be more comfortable returning to his mountain home where he belongs. He belongs wherever he chooses to be," Catherine replied firmly. "And as long as I own this ranch, he's welcome here whenever he wishes to visit." The wedding ring on her finger caught the morning light as she crossed her arms, but for the first time since James's death, Catherine found herself more focused on the future than the past. Ezra stood at the edge of the Morrison property line, his father's gold pocket watch heavy in his palm as he considered the choice before him. The timepiece had been his grandfather's before that, passed down through 3 generations of Kane men who had believed in duty, honor, and the courage to stand for what was right, even when the cost was high. The watch face showed 4:30 in the afternoon, but the time that mattered wasn't measured in hours and minutes. It was measured in the moments a man had left to decide what kind of person he truly was, someone who ran from difficulty or someone who stayed to fight for what mattered. Frank Delacroix had ridden up the mountain that morning with news of the delegation's visit and Catherine's fierce defense of their friendship. The foreman's account had painted a picture of a woman under siege, facing social pressure that could affect her business, her daughter's future, and her standing in the only community she had ever known. She stood up to all of them, Frank had reported with obvious admiration. Told Reverend Williams and his crew exactly what she thought of their concerns. "But Ezra, this isn't going to end with one confrontation. These people are scared of what you represent, and scared people can be dangerous in ways that go beyond harsh words." Now Ezra faced the decision that had been brewing since Lily's letter first arrived. He could return to his mountain sanctuary, disappear back into the safety of isolation, and allow Catherine to rebuild her social standing without the burden of defending an unwanted association. It would be the practical choice, the one that protected everyone from further complications, or he could fight for something he had thought lost forever, the possibility of human connection, of purpose beyond mere survival, of a life that mattered to someone other than himself. The pocket watch had belonged to his father, a circuit judge who had spent his career defending the principle that justice meant protecting the innocent even when public opinion demanded otherwise. Judge Samuel Kane had faced down lynch mobs, corrupt politicians, and social pressure that would have broken lesser men, all because he believed that doing right mattered more than being popular. "Time's the one thing you can't make more of, son," his father had said when passing down the watch. "But you can choose how to spend what you've got. Spend it on things that matter, with people who deserve your loyalty, fighting battles worth winning." Ezra snapped the watch closed and slipped it back into his vest pocket. The weight of it seemed to settle something in his chest, a resolve that had been building through weeks of careful consideration. He had spent 8 years running from the judgment of others, convincing himself that isolation was a form of nobility rather than cowardice. But Catherine Morrison had shown him a different kind of courage, the strength to build something meaningful in the face of loss, to take responsibility for others' welfare, even when it would be easier to think only of herself. She had defended him to her neighbors not because it was safe or convenient, but because it was right. The ride down to the ranch house took him past familiar landmarks that had begun to feel like guideposts toward a future he hadn't dared imagine. The stand of aspen where he had taught Lily to identify different bird calls. The creek where Catherine had confessed her fears about raising a daughter alone in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to anyone who dared to be different. He found her in the garden behind the main house, working among the vegetables with the focused intensity of someone who found peace in the rhythm of physical labor. Her hands were dirty from transplanting seedlings, and her hair had escaped its pins to curl around her face in the afternoon heat. "Catherine," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up with surprise that quickly transformed into something warmer. "Ezra, Frank said he was going to speak with you about yesterday's visitors." "He did." Ezra dismounted, and approached her slowly, noting the way she wiped her hands on her apron before facing him fully. "I wanted to thank you for what you said to them, and to apologize for the trouble my presence has caused you." "You have nothing to apologize for," Catherine replied firmly. "Those people have no right to dictate who I can or cannot associate with." "Perhaps not," Ezra agreed. "But they do have the power to make your life difficult, to affect your business relationships, to create problems for Lily at school, to make you an outsider in your own community." Catherine's chin lifted with the stubborn pride that had helped her survive widowhood and build a ranching empire. "Let them try," she said. "I've faced worse than small-town gossip." Ezra pulled out his father's watch and held it where she could see the golden surface gleaming in the afternoon sun. "My father used to say that some fights are worth having regardless of the cost. That standing for principle matters more than standing with the crowd." "Wise man," Catherine observed. "I hope so," Ezra replied, "because I've decided to fight for this, for whatever this is between us, for the right be part of Lily's life, for the chance to be something more than just a cautionary tale told around Millbrook's dinner tables." The first step toward their new beginning came 6 months later, when Catherine finally removed her wedding ring and placed it carefully in the small velvet box where it would rest alongside the matching band that had never left James's finger. The simple gold circles lay side by side in the darkness, symbols of a love that had shaped her but no longer defined her future. Standing in her bedroom, Catherine studied her bare hand with a mixture of sadness and relief. The pale band of skin where the ring had rested for 11 years would fade with time, just as the sharp edges of her grief had softened into something more manageable. James would always be part of her story, but he no longer needed to be the final chapter. The decision hadn't come easily or suddenly. It had grown through countless conversations with Ezra, through watching how naturally he interacted with Lily, through recognizing the quality of his character in dozens of small gestures and quiet kindnesses. When he repaired the broken fence near the north pasture, without being asked, when he spent an entire afternoon helping Lily with arithmetic that frustrated her, when he listened to Catherine's concerns about ranch management with genuine interest and thoughtful advice. These moments had built a foundation of trust and affection that couldn't be ignored. The community's initial hostility had gradually given way to grudging acceptance as people observed Ezra's behavior over time. His participation in the church barn raising, despite Reverend Williams's obvious disapproval, had demonstrated both skill and character. His gentle handling of Tom McCrady's fractious horse had earned the storekeeper's respect. Most importantly, his obvious devotion to Lily and respectful treatment of Catherine had made it difficult for even their harshest critics to maintain their objections. "Mama." Lily's voice came from the doorway, accompanied by the soft tap of her walking stick against the wooden floor. The child's leg had healed completely, but she still occasionally used the stick when tired or when the weather made her old injury ache. "Yes, sweetheart. Ezra's here. He brought something for you." Catherine slipped the velvet box into her dresser drawer and followed her daughter downstairs, where she found Ezra waiting in the parlor with an expression of nervous anticipation. In his hands he held a small wooden box that he had clearly crafted himself, its surface smooth and perfectly fitted, decorated with delicate carvings of roses and vines. "I wanted to give you something," he said, rising as she entered the room. "Something that represents what I hope we might be building together." Catherine accepted the box with curious fingers, noting the careful craftsmanship and the time such work must have required. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, lay 2 wedding bands, not the ornate rings that wealth might demand, but simple bands of warm gold that spoke of honest commitment and enduring love. "I made them myself," Ezra said quietly, "from gold that Frank helped me trade for with a prospector up near the high country. I know they're not fancy, but I wanted them to be something I created with my own hands, something that would be ours alone." Catherine lifted one of the rings, noting how it caught the lamplight with a warm glow that seemed to promise comfort rather than possession. The band was slightly wider than traditional women's rings, practical for someone who worked with her hands, yet feminine enough to honor her essential nature. "They're beautiful," she said, and meant it. But Ezra Are you certain marriage would mean giving up your mountain home, your solitude, everything you've built up there? What I built up there was survival, Ezra replied, taking her free hand in both of his. What we could build together would be a life worth living. Catherine, I love you. I love your strength, your intelligence, your fierce protection of the people you care about. I love the way you've opened your heart to trust again, despite everything you've lost. Lily bounced excitedly on her toes, unable to contain her enthusiasm any longer. Does this mean Ezra's going to be my new papa? Does this mean he's going to live here with us always? Catherine looked down at her daughter's hopeful face, then back at Ezra's patient expression. He would wait for her answer without pressure. He understood the magnitude of what he was asking and the courage it would require for her to say yes. It means, Catherine said slowly, slipping the ring onto her finger where it settled with surprising rightness, that we're going to try something new, something that honors the past but isn't imprisoned by it. The new wedding bands gleamed in the lamplight, symbols of second chances and the belief that love could indeed triumph over loss, fear, and the narrow judgments of those too frightened to embrace possibility. The bronze church bell that had arrived by freight wagon 3 weeks earlier now hung in the newly constructed bell tower, its surface gleaming in the afternoon sun as the entire community of Millbrook gathered for an unprecedented celebration. The bell bore an inscription in flowing script, donated by the Morrison family in memory of James Morrison and in honor of Second Chances, 1884. Ezra stood beside the rope that would ring the bell for the first time, his hand steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The past year had transformed him from hermit to respected member of the community, but it was this final gesture that would complete his journey back to the world of other people. Today, he would ring the bell that called his neighbors to worship in the church he had helped design and build. The new sanctuary rose behind him, constructed on the site where his old church had once stood before the fire that changed everything. But this building was different, larger, more beautiful, and built with the combined efforts of a community that had learned to see past their fears to the truth of a man's character. Catherine stood with Lily at the front of the gathered crowd, both wearing their finest dresses for the dedication ceremony. On Catherine's hand, the simple gold band Ezra had crafted caught the light, while around Lily's neck hung her silver locket, the same one that had connected her to family during those frightening days in the mountain cabin. The child had grown tall and strong over the past year, her limp completely gone, her spirit as bright and curious as ever. Sheriff Harper stepped forward, his weathered face creased with something that might have been embarrassment. In his hands he carried the yellowed wanted poster that had hung in his office for 8 years, bearing Ezra's photograph and the charges that had driven him into exile. Reverend Kane, Harper said formally, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. I owe you an apology, and I owe this community the truth. The sheriff tore the poster in half, then in half again, letting the pieces fall to the ground where they scattered in the afternoon breeze. This man was never a criminal. He was never dangerous to anyone except those who threatened the people under his protection. I should have taken it down years ago, and I'm sorry it took me this long to find the courage to do what was right. A murmur ran through the crowd, but it was approval rather than discord. Over the past months, people had seen Ezra's true nature revealed through his actions. They had watched him work alongside them on the church construction, treating everyone with respect, regardless of their previous hostility. They had seen his gentle patience with their children, his wise counsel for their problems, his willingness to help anyone in need without seeking recognition or reward. Reverend Williams, who had initially led the opposition to Ezra's presence in their community, now stepped forward with visible humility. Brother Kane, he said, extending his hand, I was wrong about you, about what kind of man you are, about what you might bring to our community. I let fear and prejudice blind me to the grace of God, working in your life. Ezra shook the offered hand, his expression free of bitterness or resentment. We all make mistakes, Marcus. What matters is that we learn from them and try to do better. The crowd began to murmur its agreement as Ezra took hold of the bell rope. This wasn't just the dedication of a new church, it was the restoration of a man's reputation, the healing of a community's conscience, and the celebration of love's triumph over fear and mistrust. "Before I ring this bell," Ezra said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled townspeople, "I want to thank all of you for giving me the chance to prove that a man can change, that redemption is possible, and that sometimes the very experiences that seem to destroy us can become the foundation for building something better." He looked directly at Catherine, seeing in her eyes the love and support that had made this moment possible. "I also want to thank my wife and daughter for showing me that isolation isn't strength. It's just another kind of fear. True strength comes from opening your heart to others, even when they might disappoint you, even when love comes with the risk of loss." Ezra pulled the rope with steady hands, and the bronze bell sang out across the valley with a clear, sweet tone that seemed to carry the promise of new beginnings. The sound echoed off the mountains where he had spent 8 years in exile, then rolled down into the town that had finally learned to welcome him home. In that moment, with the bell's song filling the air and his family beside him, EZRA KANE understood that some journeys lead us away from ourselves, while others bring us back to who we were always meant to be. This bell would ring for years to come, calling people to worship, to community, and to the radical notion that every person deserves a second chance at grace.